So this is a two-sided carving that's actually going to go outside. So I'm using cypress wood. I happen to have two cypress boards laying around the shop from another project, which is an excellent choice for an exterior grade lumber. This is commonly what they use to make fences out of. So you can see they're about a little over 7 inches wide by about an inch thick. I wasn't going to plane these down or anything. The customer specifically said that she wanted a hand-hewn look, so that's what I was going for. I basically roughed out these dimensions. Now, as a heads up before I get too far into this video, at least half of this is going to be showing you how I got the design onto the wood, because that is a large part of the process. So if you're not interested in that, the portion of carving this is actually quite small compared to the process of laying out the design. But you can see I had my 4 timbers. This sign is about a little less than 3 feet by 3 feet. I had exact dimensions. I don't remember them precisely, but roughly a little less than 3 by 3. And these boards were pretty true already, but the edges were rough sawn. So all I did, because I don't have a jointer, was, and I mention this every time I show this process does not work on timbers that are severely cupped or twisted. It's actually quite dangerous to send them through the table saw that way. These weren't bad, so I just ripped off one edge. I could flip the board, so now I have a flat edge running against my fence, and I could rip off this other edge, and that will just give me a nice jointed seam, so I could glue all these boards together. Like I said, pretty simple process that works on boards that are not severely compromised, and saves a bunch of planing and jointing and whatnot. So there's my stack, and now that you can, before I showed there was some hairline gaps that wasn't even that bad, but now the shadows will look like gaps because these are uneven boards, but essentially there's really no seams in any of these joints, which is what I'm going for. So in order to glue these together, I'm making sure for warping purposes, I'm pointing out the grain of the lumber. You want to alternate how the grain runs on these boards. If you have all the warp going either top side or bottom side, that will make the whole piece cup quite severely. If you alternate it, the forces the wood have, especially when it gets wet or the humidity changes, they kind of end up counteracting against each other and they won't move nearly as much. So that's why I pointed out the Sharpies, knowing where the growth rings are and then alternating them up and down either way. It's basically I'm putting the cup side up and then reversing the cup side down and then the cup side up. So you can see I had 2 little pieces in order to get the width I needed on the edges, but that worked out fine because there's going to be a design covering the majority of this. I glued all this together. I'm using Titebond 3, which is what I usually use in the shop, but that is also a glue that's rated for exterior use, and this sign will be painted. So the next day I could come and take all my clamps off and put some C-clamps on the edges just to keep it from bowing too much. And you will see, because I didn't plane these, that there is quite a large bit of undulation in all the seams. So before I started, I took a spoke shave and I just kind of flattened that a little bit. Like I said, this is the entire surface of this essentially is going to be carved, so I didn't spend too much time flattening it. It wasn't necessary for the process. But you could see what I mean by there's quite a bit of undulation. But you could also see how I alternated those growth rings, kind of kept it as much at bay as possible. So then if you watch the channel, you know that I got a vinyl cutter a little while ago. And this is the design I have in Photoshop, and the vinyl cutter was not wide enough to cut this whole thing, so I in Photoshop I split it in half. There's 2 parts to the sign, and then I could use this program which will convert a JPEG to an SVG, which is what you need if you're using a vinyl cutter. It's free if you're not uploading a ton of files, and then I could upload those into my program for the vinyl cutter. I did a review on this a little while ago, and I knew I was going to be doing this project when they asked me to review it, And usually I use a projector in order to project the design onto whatever I'm doing. But for this project and stuff, this vinyl cutter is great. All the alignment's perfect, everything's square. And the problem with the projector is it could be a pain to set it up, but also you're hand drawing everything, which is time consuming, and it's not always perfectly accurate because my hand is obviously not the equivalent of a computer. So this was very simple to just import this, Photoshop it so I could have the width I needed, import it into the program, and the vinyl cutter cuts it, and then I could just transfer this vinyl onto the sign. Now this sign, like I said, is going to be double-sided, so I didn't want to waste a ton of vinyl, so I was able to reuse the vinyl on both sides, and I'll show you how I did that. But I'm essentially just removing all of the what will become the negative space. The design that you see that I'm leaving with the vinyl is going to be raised. This is a relief carving, so that part will be raised, and any white space you see is what will become the negative part of the carving. So I just have transfer tape on this, and I could just transfer this to the sign. The vinyl is almost the exact same size as my board there. Now there's going to be a border around this, but I'm not putting that into the sign. I'm going to add a border afterwards. The reason I did that is because with all this end grain, if the sign's hanging out and gets wet, the end grain on the top of the sign will swell quite drastically. So putting a frame around the top where you have edge grain exposed to the elements will just make the longevity of this much longer. So we'll extend the longevity of it is a better way to say that. So then, as you can see, I spray painted this so that the design would transfer. Obviously I can't just take it off without having transferred the design some way. So spray paint was a super cost effective way to do that. Then I could just add more transfer tape onto the vinyl that was already on that side, and then transfer this to the back side of the piece. Like I said, if you are excellent at drawing, this is something you could freehand. I am not. I used to do this with a projector, but this vinyl is just really convenient for transferring patterns, especially larger detailed ones like this. A lot of times it could be a pain getting all the sizing accurate and everything centered. So this was just really nice. And then obviously I spray painted this again on this side, but this time you'll see what it looks like when I pull that vinyl off, because two-sided sign, and this is the second side, so I won't need this vinyl anymore. And this was a fun carving. I do enjoy carvings, but I also really liked the design of the piece, which does make a difference when you're doing something. So this is essentially what that pattern transfer looks like. Like I said in the beginning, the majority of this video and a large part of this project was just getting that design perfectly put onto the piece of lumber I had. Now you could do something like this by hand, but that's going to be extremely time consuming. So these are the bits that I use in a rotary tool in order to get this done. This is not sponsored or anything. These are just the ones that I got off of Amazon that I like. And essentially all I'm doing for this, it's very simple, is I'm just undercutting around the entire design. So I have a cylinder shaped bit, and I'm holding it at roughly a 45-degree angle, and I'm just tracing all my outlines and essentially undercutting that edge. And I did that around the whole piece. Now the edges of this, like I said, they wanted it to look hand hewn, so I used a mallet in order to get that kind of look of chisel work around the edges. And once I had all the undercutting done, I could go through with the chisel and remove all of this background, because that undercutting essentially is a stop cut in carving. So you're breaking up the grain, and then I don't have to worry about removing any of the design as I'm going around the edges, removing that material. So on this one here, you could see I went fairly deep on the first go. With stuff like this, you're always kind of playing around with the exact look you wanted, and I knew this was going to be painted, so I didn't have to be super crazy with the detail. But after I had the background removed, I decided I wanted the relief to be a little bit more severe than it was, and I went through and I did the exact same thing. And just, you could see, and I have this in normal speed, just going through, and you're basically lowering anything that's the background, and that will make the foreground pop out. Like I said, I find stuff like this to be pretty simple. A Dremel could do this sort of work. Like I said, you could do this by hand, but that will be quite time consuming. You're basically just tracing a pattern with a tool, and then that's kind of what it looks like once I was done. So the worst part of this process was, like I said, there is two sides. So once that first side was done, I did the exact same thing on the back side. The plus side of doing things twice is the second part of everything always goes by faster, because I knew exactly how deep I wanted to go, so I didn't have to carve it twice. I just started with the depth I wanted right off the bat. And then the bottom part of this sign is just going to be type, so it's the same process. I'm just going to outline all the letters. This is a smaller bit and a smaller shank in my tool, and I'm just going through, and once again I'm holding at roughly a 45, so you're creating essentially a half of a V groove around the whole thing. It will make all the letters pop, and then once again when I go to remove the background of the material, which will push those letters to the foreground, I don't have to worry about chipping anything out, because I've essentially created a stop cut around those letters. And this was actually, I didn't have enough of that cypress, so this is actually yellow pine that I made this bottom part of the sign from. So like I said, I was going to make a frame around this. I had some old 2x4s laying around, which I decided to use because the growth rings are much tighter, which means it will not rot as fast. I've made it clear to the customer, and I didn't want to use pressure treated lumber, that obviously this is if they're going to paint it, and I recommend keeping up on the maintenance of the sign to extend the lifespan of the sign, which they were fine with. But painted stuff outside, I know pressure treated is kind of the end all be all for outdoor stuff, but having grown up in an old Victorian home before pressure treated was popular, if you maintain the maintenance of lumber outside, it can last quite a while. So basically all I did now is I'm putting a rather large groove. The frame is a little less than 1 inch at this point because I removed all of that material around the background on both sides. But I'm basically just making a large dado in this pine, and then the sign will nestle in place. So I was going to put miters on the edge, but I wanted a more stable joint, and because this is going outside, it's guaranteed that this lumber will move, and it was pretty much going to be a guarantee the miters would at some point expand and split. So I decided to just do frame this with edges. You could see I'm just putting those pieces on, and I'm leaving myself quite a nice gap on both sides. Because this is solid lumber, like I said, this frame is going to move quite a bit, so you want to leave some space in that frame for expansion. And then once I had it on there, I could just make all my measurements and cut my pieces. So to finish this off, I put just a piece of that cypress in the dado to kind of fill that hole, and then I'm putting a dowel all the way through the top of this frame into the other frame, and this is one of the reasons I did it this way. This dowel will be a solid joint through this whole thing, so even if these edges kind of want to splinter apart, that dowel will always hold this together. I don't like using exposed hardware outside, even if it's stainless steel. It's almost a guarantee that water will eventually work its way down into that hardware, and you'll start getting rot wherever you have hardware. And then to finish this up, I just put a smaller bit on there and cleaned up all the pieces. You could kind of see the detail work of the sign. Because this isn't painted, it's a little hard to see the difference between the background and the foreground. And then to finish it up, I just kind of, even though it was going to be painted, I still removed all of my spray paint marks that were left over and kind of evened out the surface of the piece. And that is what the sign looks like. And you can see that other sign kind of will hang from the bottom. And then I wasn't responsible for painting this, which I was quite happy about. So I can only assume what it looks like at this point, but that is basically that.